I told my husband I was leaving for the weekend to stay with my sister, and I watched his face when I said it because I needed to see if he would look relieved. He did. It was small, just a flicker at the corner of his mouth, but I had been watching that face for 7 years and I knew every version of it. I packed a bag in front of him, folded 3 days of clothes the way a woman does when she wants to be believed, and I kissed my daughter Lily on the forehead before I set her down in her crib for her afternoon nap. Nathan hugged me at the door like he meant it, told me to drive safe, told me he loved me. Then he closed the door behind me a little too fast. I didn't go to my sister's house. I parked 2 streets away, behind the old Baptist church where nobody would recognize my car, and I opened the app on my phone that connected to the baby monitor in Lily's room, the one Nathan didn't know had a second hidden camera I'd installed myself 3 weeks earlier, the one with audio that could pick up a whisper from across the hallway. I sat in the driver's seat with my hands shaking, waiting. For 20 minutes nothing happened. Nathan walked past the camera twice, phone pressed to his ear, laughing at something, and I told myself I was being paranoid, that this was exactly the kind of thing a woman does when postpartum anxiety refuses to leave even after her baby turns 1.5. I almost drove home right then, almost decided to laugh this off as one more thing I'd never tell anyone about. Then I heard his mother's voice come through the speaker and my whole body went cold because Diane wasn't supposed to be there. I hadn't heard the front door. She must have used her spare key, the one I'd asked Nathan a dozen times to take back and he never had. "Is she really gone?" Diane asked, her voice pitched low, the voice she used when she thought no one important was listening. "Gone for the whole weekend," Nathan said. "Told her sister some sob story about needing space. She bought it." "Good," Diane said, "because we don't have much time before the papers need to be filed." I gripped the phone so hard my knuckles went white. "Papers? What papers?" "You're sure this will hold up?" Nathan asked. "I don't want this blowing up in our faces." "It will hold up," Diane said. "I've already talked to the doctor. He owes me a favor from your father's estate. He'll sign off on the psychiatric evaluation saying she's unstable, showing signs of postpartum psychosis. Combined with the financial records we're building, no judge will give her the house or the baby." I had to put my hand over my mouth to keep from making a sound. The house was mine. My father had left me the down payment in his will 3 years before he died, and Nathan knew that, had signed papers acknowledging it when we refinanced, had stood in a lawyer's office and said the words, "This is Emily's inheritance," out loud. "What about the money in her savings account?" Nathan asked, "the one from her dad." "Once she's declared unfit, everything goes into a conservatorship," Diane said, "and guess who gets named the responsible party?" I sat frozen in that car for what felt like an hour but was really 11 minutes, because I checked the timestamp later, the exact moment my entire marriage turned into a crime scene I hadn't been invited to witness. My husband and his mother were planning to have me declared mentally unfit, take my inheritance, take my house, and take my daughter, also they could split whatever was left of a life I had spent 7 years building with a man I thought loved me. I wanted to drive straight home and scream until the walls shook, but something colder took over, something that had been building in me for months without a name, and that something told me to keep listening, keep recording, and say absolutely nothing. Because if I confronted them now, they would deny everything, clean up the trail, and I would be the crazy woman making accusations with nothing to back them up. I needed proof. I needed all of it. I want to back up because none of this happened out of nowhere, and if I only tell you about that one afternoon in the car, you won't understand how a woman ends up hiding behind a church with her hands shaking, listening to her own husband plan to steal her life. I met Nathan when I was 25, working as a hospital administrator at a regional medical center 2 hours outside Columbus, Ohio. He was charming in that easy, unhurried way some men have, the kind of charm that makes you feel like the only person in a crowded room, and for the first 2 years he was exactly that man, patient and warm and endlessly attentive. We got married when I was 27, in a small ceremony at my father's request, because my father was already sick by then, already losing weight in a way none of us wanted to talk about, and he wanted to walk me down the aisle while he still could. I remember that wedding more clearly than almost any other day of my life, not because of the dress or the flowers, but because of the way my father gripped my arm just before we walked down the aisle, steadier than he had any right to be given how sick he was, and whispered, "You picked a good one, Emmy, I can tell." I believed him completely that day. I think, in fairness to the man Nathan used to be, my father wasn't entirely wrong, not at first. Nathan was attentive to my father in those final months in a way that still confuses me now, knowing everything I know because it never once felt performative at the time. He drove my father to 2 chemotherapy appointments when I couldn't get away from work. He sat with him for hours watching old westerns neither of them particularly liked, just so my father wouldn't be alone on the days I had a double shift. I've spent a long time since trying to decide whether that version of Nathan was real and simply eroded over time, or whether it was always, on some level, a performance for an audience that mattered to him. I don't think I'll ever have a satisfying answer, and I've made a kind of peace with that. He died 8 months later, and in his will, he left me the majority of his savings, nearly $200,000, along with the explicit instruction that it be used toward a home, something stable, something no one could take from me. The irony of that specific wording, something no one could take from me, written by a dying man who could not have known how precisely those words would matter 7 years later, is not lost on me, and there were nights during the darkest part of this whole ordeal when I genuinely wondered if some part of him had sensed, even from a hospital bed, exactly what kind of protection his daughter was eventually going to need. I used that money as the down payment on the house Nathan and I still lived in, a 4-bedroom colonial on Larchwood Drive with a wraparound porch my father would have loved. Nathan's name went on the deed too, because I trusted him, because that's what marriage is supposed to mean, but the mortgage documents and the closing paperwork all specified the source of the down payment, all specified it came from my father's estate. I didn't think much of that detail at the time. I thought it was just paperwork, just formality, the kind of thing lawyers require so everyone stays honest. I didn't know that 7 years later, that single paragraph of legal language would become the exact thing my husband and his mother were trying to erase. Deanne never liked me, not really, not from the very first dinner I had at her house when Nathan and I were still dating. She had a way of asking questions that sounded like compliments but landed like accusations, things like, "And what does your father do again, I forget," when I had told her 3 times already that he'd passed. She favored Nathan's older brother, Curtis, openly and without apology, because Curtis had married a woman named Patris who came from what Diane called an established family, and Diane made sure I understood the difference between established families and mine every chance she got. When Lily was born, I thought things might soften, the way grandchildren sometimes soften even difficult people. For a few months they did. Deanne visited more, brought over casseroles, held Lily like she'd been waiting her whole life for a granddaughter, and I let myself believe we'd finally found our footing. Then Curtis and Patris had their son, a boy they named after Nathan's late father, and Diane's attention shifted overnight like a switch had been flipped. She stopped visiting as often. When she did visit, her comments about Lily grew smaller and sharper, comparisons to her grandson that always favored him, remarks about how boys carry the family name, and how she hoped Nathan and I would try again for a son eventually. I started noticing other things too, things I'd chalked up to normal marriage friction at the time, but that looking back formed a pattern I should have recognized much sooner. Nathan began working later, first once a week, then twice, then most nights, always with an explanation that sounded reasonable on its own but strange when you stacked them all together. He started taking phone calls in the garage with the door shut, something he'd never done before Lily was born. 6 months before the afternoon in the car, I found a receipt in his jacket pocket for a boutique hotel 40 minutes outside the city, dated for a Tuesday I remembered specifically, because it was the same Tuesday he'd told me he had a mandatory late meeting and asked his mother to pick up Lily from daycare instead of me. I didn't say anything. I told myself there was an explanation, that maybe it was a work retreat, that maybe I was building a story out of nothing because I was exhausted and lonely and looking for something to blame. But the feeling didn't go away. It sat in my stomach every single day, that low hum of wrongness that women are taught to distrust in themselves long before they're taught to trust it, and eventually the hum got loud enough that I couldn't pretend not to hear it anymore. I started paying attention the way a nurse pays attention to vital signs, quietly, methodically, without letting the patient know they're being watched. I began checking the family calendar app we shared for scheduling Lily's pediatrician visits, and I noticed Nathan had started deleting entries almost as soon as he created them, leaving no trace except the notification history buried in my own phone settings, which he apparently didn't know existed. I found a name that kept appearing and disappearing from that calendar, Vanessa, a coworker, according to Nathan, someone from his firm's marketing department he'd mentioned once or twice in passing, always with a tone so casual it should have meant nothing. The tone was the tell. People don't need to work that hard to sound casual about someone who actually means nothing to them. I remember exactly when the tone of our marriage first shifted, even though it took me over a year to admit I'd noticed it in real time. It was a Sunday morning, 7 months after Lily was born, and Nathan came downstairs already dressed for a run he hadn't mentioned the night before, moving through the kitchen with the quiet efficiency of someone who had rehearsed the morning in his head before he ever opened his eyes. I asked where he was headed, and he said, "Just need to clear my head," which was true enough, I suppose, just not in the way I understood it at the time. He started running 4 mornings a week after that, then 5, and I told myself I was proud of him, that new fatherhood had scared him into taking better care of himself. And for a while I even believed that story because it was easier than the alternative and because exhausted new mothers don't always have the bandwidth to interrogate every small change in the person sleeping beside them. Looking back, I can trace the running schedule almost exactly onto the same months Vanessa later admitted, during a deposition I wasn't present for but heard about through Priya, that she and Nathan first started spending time together outside the office. At the time, though, all I saw was a man getting healthier, and I thanked God for it. Diane's coldness toward Lily and me built the same way in increments too small to name individually, the kind of erosion you only recognize once you step back far enough to see the whole shoreline that's disappeared. There was the Thanksgiving when she seated Curtis and Patris's newborn son in the place of honor at the head of the table nearest her, while Lily's high chair got pushed to the far corner near the kitchen door, close enough to the noise and traffic that she cried through half the meal. There was the birthday card for Lily's second birthday that arrived a full week late, unsigned with a generic $10 bill inside, the same week Curtis's son received a $500 savings bond delivered in person with photographs taken to commemorate the moment. I remember that particular Thanksgiving in sharper detail than almost any other family gathering, because it was the first time I saw the favoritism play out so plainly that even Nathan, who usually managed to look past his mother's behavior entirely, went quiet at the table. Diane spent nearly 20 minutes narrating Curtis's son's early milestones to the table, his first steps, a word he'd said that sounded almost like grandma, a drawing he'd made that she'd already had framed and hung in her hallway, while Lily sat within arm's reach, babbling and reaching for anyone who would give her attention, largely unacknowledged. At one point, Lily knocked over her small cup of water reaching for a roll, and Diane's reaction was sharp enough that 3 other people at the table turned to look, an exasperated "oh, for heaven's sake," that would have sounded almost reasonable if I hadn't watched her, not 10 minutes earlier, laugh warmly when Curtis's son had thrown an entire plate of mashed potatoes onto the floor. I caught Patris's eye across the table in that moment, and something passed between us, quick and wordless, the recognition of 2 women watching the same double standard play out in real time, and neither of us yet ready to say anything about it out loud. Nathan, when I brought it up quietly in the car on the drive home, said only, "She's always been like this. It's not really about Lily specifically," which I understand now was likely true in the broadest sense, that Diane's cruelty long predated my daughter's existence, but which did nothing at the time to make it feel less aimed directly at the 2 of us. I brought it up to Nathan exactly once, sitting on the edge of our bed while he checked his phone, and I said carefully that I sometimes felt like his mother saw Lily as a lesser grandchild. He didn't deny it. That's the detail that has stayed with me longer than almost anything else from that period. He just sighed, the particular sigh of a man who has already decided a conversation isn't worth the energy it would take to actually have it, and said, "That's just how she is, Em. Don't take it personally," as if there were some version of that statement that wasn't inherently personal to the daughter it was being said about. I want to tell you about the hotel receipt in more detail, because I skipped past it too quickly before and it deserves the weight it actually carried. I found it while doing laundry, not snooping, genuinely just emptying pockets before a wash cycle the way I'd done 1,000 times before without incident, and my fingers closed around a folded slip of paper that didn't belong in a work blazer. The Cardinal Ridge Inn, a boutique property 40 minutes outside the city known, I later learned from a quick search I immediately regretted running, for weekend getaways rather than business travel. The charge was for a Tuesday night, 1 room, breakfast for 2 included in the package, dated exactly 9 days earlier. I remembered that Tuesday specifically because Nathan had called me at 4 in the afternoon, apologetic and rushed, saying a client meeting had run long and turned into a mandatory dinner he couldn't get out of, asking if I could arrange for his mother to grab Lily from daycare since I had a late meeting of my own that day at the hospital. I had said, of course, don't worry about it, we'll figure it out, the way you say things when you love someone and haven't yet learned to distrust the shape of their excuses. I held that receipt in my hand for a long time that evening, standing in the laundry room with the dryer rumbling behind me, running through every innocent explanation I could construct. A work retreat, a surprise planning session for my birthday, still 2 months away, a miscommunication about which hotel his firm had booked for an out-of-town colleague he was supposedly hosting. None of them held up under even light scrutiny, and I knew it, but I folded the receipt back along its original creases and put it back exactly where I'd found it, because some part of me understood that once I said the real explanation out loud, even just to myself, I would not be able to unknow it. 3 weeks before the afternoon in the car, I did something I'm not proud of and don't regret at all. I ordered a second baby monitor camera online, the kind with a wide-angle lens and 2-way audio, and instead of putting it in Lily's room where the first one already sat in plain view, I hid it inside a decorative bird figurine on the bookshelf across from our kitchen table, angled to catch both the kitchen and the hallway leading to our bedrooms. I told myself I was being ridiculous. I told myself that if I found nothing, I would take the camera down, delete the app, and go to therapy instead of turning into the kind of woman who spies on her own husband. But some part of me, the part that had spent 7 years slowly learning to distrust her own gut, needed proof strong enough that no one, including myself, could talk me out of believing it. For those first 3 weeks, the camera caught nothing but ordinary life. Nathan making coffee, Nathan on work calls, Nathan playing with Lily on the kitchen floor in a way that still, even now, makes something in my chest ache because I know he loved her, even if I no longer believe he loved me. I almost gave up on the whole thing. I almost decided the hum in my stomach really was just anxiety with nothing behind it. Then 4 days before that Friday, I overheard Nathan on the phone in the garage, and this time the garage door hadn't fully closed. I only caught fragments. The doctor and the house, and before she figures anything out. I stood in the kitchen with a dish towel in my hands, frozen, telling myself I'd misheard, telling myself context would make it innocent. That was the moment I decided to test the theory the only way that would actually work. I would announce a trip. I would leave visibly, convincingly, the way a woman leaves when she genuinely needs space, and I would watch what happened in a house that believed it was finally alone. If I was wrong, I would find out I was wrong, and I would never have to know the difference between suspicion and paranoia ever again. I was not wrong. Sitting in that car behind the church, listening to my husband and his mother calmly discuss having me declared psychiatrically unfit so they could seize my inheritance and my daughter, I understood for the first time in my life what it feels like when the floor of your entire reality gives out beneath you at once. Not gradually, not in stages, all at once like a trapdoor. I made myself breathe. I made myself remember that I was a hospital administrator who had spent a decade managing crises for other people, who knew how to stay calm when everything around her was falling apart, and I made myself use that skill now for myself for the first time in longer than I could remember. The recording app on my hidden camera had already been running for the full conversation, saving automatically to a cloud account Nathan had no access to and didn't even know existed. I let it keep running. I sat in that car and listened to another 40 minutes of my husband and his mother planning the destruction of my life, taking notes in my head, because I didn't dare open a notes app and risk the light from my screen drawing attention through my own car window in broad daylight, which I know now was an irrational fear, but grief and shock do strange things to logic. I learned things in those 40 minutes that took the ground out from under me a second time, and then a third. I learned that Diane had been planning this for over a year, not months, ever since Curtis and Patricia's son was born and she decided her family's inheritance, the house Nathan's father had left in trust, needed to go entirely to the family name, which apparently no longer included Lily or me. I learned that Vanessa wasn't just a coworker. Nathan had been seeing her for 8 months, and the plan, once I was declared unstable and removed from the house, was for Vanessa to move in within the year, once things settled down for Lily's sake. That single detail, the specific casualness of once things settled down for Lily's sake, did something to me that even the fraud and the fake medical evaluation hadn't quite managed, because it meant Nathan had pictured in real detail my daughter growing up with another woman in my kitchen, in my bed, at my table, and had found that picture not just acceptable but preferable, worth actively planning toward. I sat with that thought longer than I sat with almost anything else from that conversation, turning it over and over, trying to reconcile it with the man who had once driven my dying father to chemotherapy just so I wouldn't have to feel guilty about missing a day of work. Later, once Priya's office had the resources to look into it properly, I learned more about Vanessa than I ever wanted to know, small, painful details that served no legal purpose, but that I found myself unable to stop absorbing anyway, the way you can't stop pressing on a bruise even though you know exactly how much it will hurt. She was 26, 3 years into her role in the marketing department at Nathan's firm, and according to 2 coworkers who eventually spoke with Priya's investigator off the record, she had joked more than once about waiting for Nathan's situation to sort itself out. A phrase that made my stomach turn every time I thought about it because my entire life had apparently become, to at least one other person, a situation standing between her and what she wanted. I never confronted Vanessa directly. Priya advised strongly against it, both for legal reasons and, she said gently, for my own sake, telling me that closure rarely comes from the place you expect it to, and that spending my remaining emotional energy on the other woman would only slow down the parts of the process that actually mattered. I took her advice mostly, though there were nights during that period where I sat awake scrolling through Vanessa's public social media profiles anyway, looking at photos of a life that had nearly absorbed mine without my consent, until I finally forced myself to delete the apps entirely rather than keep picking at a wound Priya had correctly identified as unproductive. I learned that Nathan had already opened a separate bank account 4 months earlier and had been diverting money from our joint account into it in amounts small enough that I hadn't noticed, roughly $800 a month, which came to well over $3,000 by the time I found out. I learned that the psychiatrist Diane mentioned was an old family friend who had, in her words, owed the family a favor since a malpractice situation years earlier that Nathan's father had allegedly helped bury. And I learned in the ugliest detail of all that they intended to use my own grief, the grief I still carried over my father's death, as evidence, twisting years of ordinary sadness into a diagnosis that would strip me of everything. Later, once the divorce proceedings gave Priya's team reason to dig into Diane's history more thoroughly, I came to understand a little of where this particular cruelty had come from, not as an excuse because nothing excuses what she tried to do, but as context that at least made the shape of it comprehensible. Diane had grown up the younger of 2 daughters in a family where the elder daughter, according to relatives who spoke briefly with Priya's investigator, had been openly favored for the family's small manufacturing business, eventually inheriting nearly all of it while Diane received a modest cash settlement and, in her own words to a cousin years later, the distinct impression that she had never really counted. She had married Nathan's father young, and by all accounts had spent much of that marriage quietly determined that whatever she eventually controlled, whatever legacy passed through her hands, would never again be divided in a way that left anyone feeling the way she had felt watching her sister inherit everything that mattered. Nathan's father died when Nathan was 19, leaving the family home and a modest trust in Diane's control, and somewhere in the 12 years since, that determination to protect the family name properly had calcified into something far darker, a belief that love and inheritance were the same currency, and that currency needed to be tightly, ruthlessly controlled to mean anything at all. None of that made it easier to sit in a car behind a church listening to her plan my psychiatric destruction. If anything, understanding where the impulse came from only made it sadder, the recognition that an old, unhealed wound had been allowed to grow for decades until it became sharp enough to nearly destroy an entirely new family that had nothing to do with the original injury. I've thought about that a great deal since, about how much damage one generation's untreated grief can do to the people who come after it, and it's part of why, even now, even after everything, I've tried hard not to let my own anger calcify into something Lily inherits without ever understanding where it came from. When I finally drove away from that church, I didn't go to my sister's house, not that night. I drove to a 24-hour diner 40 minutes away, ordered coffee I never touched, and sat in a booth by myself trying to figure out how a person survives discovering that the 2 people she trusted most had spent over a year quietly building a case to erase her. I called my sister Grace around midnight and I told her everything, every word I'd heard, every plan they'd laid out like it was a business acquisition instead of a human being's entire life. Grace, who has never in her life minced words, told me exactly what I needed to hear. "You have proof," she said, "real proof. Now you stop reacting and you start building." Grace's husband, Marcus, was a paralegal at a family law firm 2 towns over, and by 9 the next morning, I was sitting across from an attorney named Priya Nazari, a sharp, unhurried woman who listened to the recording twice without saying a word, then set her pen down and looked at me with an expression I can only describe as controlled fury on my behalf. "Play it again," she said the first time it ended, and I did, watching her face for any sign of the reaction I'd been having for the past 16 hours, but Priya's expression stayed almost perfectly still, the practiced stillness of someone who has learned that clients need their attorney to be the calm one in the room, especially when nothing about the situation is calm at all. When it finished the second time, she was quiet for nearly a full minute, tapping her pen once against the legal pad in front of her before finally setting it down. "I need you to understand something before we go any further," she said. "What you have here isn't just useful. It's rare. Most people in your position have suspicion and no proof. You have a recorded conspiracy, in their own voices, describing exactly what they intended to do and roughly when. That changes everything about how fast and how aggressively we can move. This isn't just a custody case anymore," Priya told me. "What you've described is conspiracy to commit fraud, potential elder financial abuse involving your late father's estate, and depending on what this doctor actually agrees to sign, possible medical fraud as well. We're going to need everything documented, dated, and backed up in 3 separate places before you do anything else." I asked her, voice smaller than I wanted it to be, whether what I'd done, hiding a camera in my own house, recording a conversation I wasn't part of, was even legal, because some part of me was terrified that after everything, I would be the one who'd broken the law. Priya explained that our state allowed one-party consent recording, meaning as long as I was a party present in my own home, even if not physically in the room, the recording was legally admissible, and more than that, the specific content, describing plans to commit fraud, actually strengthened rather than complicated its use as evidence. "You didn't do anything wrong," she said, looking directly at me in a way that made me realize how badly I'd needed someone to say those exact words out loud. "You protected yourself and your daughter the only way you had left. Don't let anyone, including yourself, turn that into something to be ashamed of." For the next 10 days, I became someone I didn't fully recognize, calm and precise in a way that frightened me a little, because grief usually makes people fall apart, and instead mine had turned me into a machine built entirely for one purpose. I stayed at Grace's house with Lily, told Nathan I needed real space to think, and let him believe he still had the upper hand, because Priya was very clear that the worst thing I could do was tip my hand before every piece was in place. On the second day, Nathan called me 8 times before noon, his voice shifting each time between worry and impatience, telling me Lily needed her routine, telling me I was overreacting to normal marriage stress, and I let each call go to voicemail, listening back to them later with Priya sitting beside me at her office, both of us noting which phrases might later matter in a courtroom. Priya circled one line in particular where Nathan said, "You don't need to make this bigger than it is, nothing's actually happening here," a sentence that would later sound very different once played beside a recording of him discussing psychiatric evaluations with his mother. "People reveal more in their reassurances than in their accusations," Priya told me. "Write that down somewhere." On the fourth day, the forensic accountant, a methodical man named Robert Alvarez who spoke almost entirely in careful qualifications, sent over his preliminary findings, and I sat at Grace's kitchen table reading through spreadsheets that translated my entire sense of betrayal into cold, undeniable numbers. $840 a month for 4 months into an account at a bank we'd never used together. Opened the same week Deanne had apparently first raised the idea of protecting the family assets at a dinner Nathan hadn't mentioned to me. Robert's report flagged an additional pattern too, smaller transfers going back nearly 2 years, amounts under $200 scattered unevenly enough to avoid triggering the kind of attention a person might pay to a regular, predictable expense. On the 6th day, Marcus, Grace's husband, came home from the law firm where he worked with something that made even his usually unshakable calm slip a little. He'd pulled the public disciplinary history on Dr. Alan Felt, the psychiatrist Diane had mentioned in the recording, and found not 2 but 3 prior complaints, the most recent involving allegations of writing a favorable custody evaluation for a family that had, according to court filings, made a substantial donation to a charity Gayla Felt's wife chaired the following year. "It's circumstantial on its own," Marcus said, "but paired with your recording, it's not circumstantial anymore. It's a pattern with your name about to become the newest entry in it." On the 8th day, I drove to the title company myself instead of waiting for the certified copies to arrive by mail, because I needed to see the original closing documents with my own eyes, needed to physically hold the page where my father's name appeared beside the phrase "source of down payment funds" in black and white, notarized, dated, unambiguous. The clerk who helped me had no idea what those pages meant to me, no idea that I was quietly memorizing every word of a paragraph that would soon become the single most important document in my entire life, and I thanked her twice, maybe 3 times, more than the transaction really warranted. I sat in my car afterward for a long time, not shaking this time, just still, holding those pages against my chest like they were something living. Somewhere around the 7th day, something happened that came closer than anything else to unraveling the entire plan before it was ready. I had gone back to the house alone, mid-morning, while Nathan was at work, to retrieve some of Lily's favorite toys and a few of my own belongings I hadn't thought to pack the first time, and I made the mistake of underestimating how unpredictable his schedule had become since I'd left. I was halfway up the stairs when I heard his car pull into the driveway 2 hours earlier than his usual return time, and my heart slammed so hard against my ribs I could hear it in my ears. I had exactly enough time to shove the small bag of Lily's things into the hallway closet and compose my face into something resembling calm before the front door opened. Nathan called out, surprise evident in his voice, and for one long, terrible second, I genuinely believed he already knew everything, that this was the moment the mask came off for both of us on his terms instead of mine. "Just grabbing a few things for Lily," I said, forcing my voice into something light and unbothered. "Forgot her favorite blanket last time, you're home early." He studied me for a beat longer than felt comfortable, and I understood, watching him, that some small animal instinct in him was picking up on something wrong even if he couldn't name it yet. "Forgot some files," he said finally, holding up a folder as if it explained everything, and I let out a breath I hoped he couldn't hear. We stood in that hallway making stilted small talk about Lily's sleep schedule for almost 10 minutes, both of us performing normalcy for an audience of one, and the entire time, I was acutely aware that the hidden camera on the bookshelf was recording every second of it, capturing my own careful lies alongside his. I left 15 minutes later with Lily's blanket and a racing pulse that didn't slow down until I was 3 streets away, and that night I called Priya in something close to a panic, telling her what had happened, asking whether I'd blown the entire plan by being careless. "You didn't blow anything," she told me, patient in the particular way lawyers get when they've talked frightened clients off far worse ledges than this one. "You gave him a completely reasonable explanation for being in your own house. That's all that happened. Breathe." I believed her mostly, but I stopped going back to the house alone after that, letting Grace or Marcus accompany me for anything else I needed, because I understood now exactly how thin the margin for error actually was. On the 9th day, Priya called with news that shifted the entire timeline of everything that followed. The emergency protective order paperwork was ready to file, but she wanted my final confirmation before submitting it, because once it was filed there would be no quiet way back, no version of events where Nathan didn't know exactly what I'd discovered and exactly how much evidence I'd already gathered against him. "Once we file, the mask comes off for both of us," she said. "Are you ready for that?" I thought about Lily asleep in the next room at Grace's house, thought about the 11 minutes I'd spent frozen in that car listening to my own erasure being planned in real time, and I told Priya, "Yes, file it, I am more than ready." She filed it that afternoon. The 10th day was the day I went home. I opened a new bank account he didn't know about and had my paycheck redirected there. I contacted the title company that had handled our home purchase and requested certified copies of every document specifying the source of the down payment, all of which still clearly listed my father's estate as the origin of the funds, exactly as Priya suspected they would, because Nathan and Diane had apparently never actually checked whether those records could be altered after the fact. They can't. I hired a forensic accountant recommended by Priya's firm to trace the transfers Nathan had been making into his separate account, and within a week we had a full paper trail, 4 months of transfers, plus 2 years of smaller, less obvious transactions that the accountant flagged as consistent with a pattern of financial concealment, which is a polite professional way of saying my husband had been hiding money from me for far longer than I'd realized. I also learned through Marcus's contacts that the psychiatrist Diane had mentioned, a man named Dr. Alan Felt, had already faced 2 prior complaints to the state medical board, both eventually dismissed but both involving allegations of writing evaluations to benefit family friends rather than patients. Priya said that history alone would be enough to make any judge deeply skeptical of an evaluation coming from him, especially paired with a recorded conversation describing the arrangement in advance. 10 days after the afternoon in the car, I went home. I told Nathan I'd had time to think, that I missed him, that I wanted to talk things through as a family, and I watched him relax in real time, watched the tension drain out of his shoulders because he believed completely that his plan was still safely on track. What I haven't told you yet is that returning home nearly walked me directly into the trap they'd been building, because 2 days after I moved back in, Nathan suggested, gently, almost offhandedly, that it might be good for me to talk to someone, a friend of his mother's, just to help process everything, no pressure at all. I recognized the maneuver instantly because Priya had warned me it might come, a soft, low-stakes sounding invitation designed to get me into a room with Dr. Felt under circumstances that would look, on paper, entirely voluntary. I told Nathan that actually sounded like a good idea, that I'd been feeling overwhelmed and could use someone objective to talk to, and I watched relief and something close to triumph move across his face at how easy this was turning out to be. Priya, when I called her immediately afterward from the bathroom with the water running to cover my voice, was very clear about what needed to happen next. "You're not walking into a room alone with that man," she said. "If you agree to any evaluation, it happens on our terms with our chosen provider in a setting we control, and only after the protective order is filed and this whole arrangement becomes moot. Stall him. Tell him you want to find someone yourself, someone you feel comfortable with. Buy us the days we need." I did exactly that, telling Nathan over dinner that I appreciated the suggestion but wanted to research therapists myself, that I'd feel more comfortable choosing someone rather than being handed a name, and though I watched a flicker of frustration cross his face, he didn't push, likely calculating that a few extra days wouldn't meaningfully change the outcome he believed was already secured. Those few days turned out to be exactly the window Priya needed to finish preparing the emergency filing, and by the time Nathan brought up Dr. Felt's name a second time, hoping to nudge me toward an actual appointment, the protective order was already sitting in a folder on Priya's desk, ready to be filed the following morning. I sometimes think about how close that moment came to going differently, how if I'd resisted Nathan's suggestion outright instead of appearing to consider it, he and Diane might have grown suspicious sooner, moved faster, buried the money deeper, coached Dr. Felt more carefully before anyone outside the family ever heard his name. Priya told me afterward that my instinct to stall rather than refuse was, in her professional opinion, the single most important decision I made in the entire process, more important even than the recording itself, because it bought the exact amount of time needed to turn suspicion into an airtight case. Deanne came over that same evening, invited by Nathan under the guise of a family dinner to reconnect, and I cooked, I set the table, I smiled through a performance so convincing it frightened me a little to discover I was capable of it. Lily sat in her high chair between us, banging a spoon against her tray, completely unaware that the three adults around her were locked in a war she would someday be old enough to understand. Partway through dinner, Deanne made a comment about how stressed I'd seemed lately, how she hoped I was taking care of myself, and I recognized the opening line of exactly the narrative they intended to build in front of witnesses, the story of an unstable, overwhelmed young mother who needed intervention for her own good. I smiled and agreed that yes, I had been under a lot of stress lately. I just didn't tell them why. Diane pressed further, the way she always did once she found a thread she thought would unravel something useful. You know, she said, setting down her fork with theatrical gentleness, there's no shame in admitting when things feel like too much. Nathan mentioned you've been having trouble sleeping. Some crying that doesn't seem tied to anything in particular. I hadn't cried in front of Nathan once during that 10-day stretch, not once, and I understood in that moment that they were already rehearsing testimony for a hearing that hadn't been scheduled yet, already building a story out of nothing so it would sound seasoned and credible by the time they needed it. I appreciate you noticing, I said, keeping my voice light, almost grateful sounding, because Priya had specifically coached me on this exact scenario 2 days earlier. Being a mother is a lot some days. I think most women would tell you that. Nathan reached over and squeezed my hand across the table, and I let him, even though every part of my skin wanted to pull away because Priya's instructions had been explicit, give them nothing that contradicts the picture of a woman calmly, happily reintegrating into her marriage. We're going to figure this all out together, Nathan said, and Diane smiled at both of us like a woman watching a plan fall neatly into place. After they left that night, I stood at the kitchen sink washing dishes I didn't need to wash, staring at the little bird figurine on the shelf across the room, thinking about how many more conversations that hidden camera had already captured, how many more small, damning admissions Nathan and Diane had made in what they believed was the privacy of my own kitchen. I didn't sleep much that night either, but not for the reasons Diane had tried to plant at the table. I lay awake running through every piece of evidence Priya and I had assembled, checking and rechecking it in my mind the way you check a lock on a door before a storm. 2 days after that dinner, Priya filed for an emergency protective order alongside our divorce petition, one that included the recorded conversation as supporting evidence, along with the financial records, the forensic accounting report, and a formal complaint against Dr. Felt filed simultaneously with the state medical board. Nathan was served at his office in front of his coworkers, which I did not orchestrate but did not particularly mourn either, given everything I now knew about which coworker he'd been spending his lunch breaks with. The protective order wasn't the kind that removed him from a place of danger to me physically, because there had never been violence between us, only a slower, colder kind of harm that the law has a harder time naming. It was a temporary custody and financial order, granting me sole possession of the house pending the divorce, freezing the joint accounts, and explicitly barring any attempt to initiate psychiatric evaluation proceedings against me outside of standard court-ordered process. Nathan called me 11 times that first day. I didn't answer any of them. Deanne called twice, then stopped because Priya had already sent a formal notice to her attorney once she hired one, informing her that any further contact regarding custody or the estate would be treated as an attempt to influence an active legal matter. The story could have ended there with paperwork and silence, but families like Nathan's don't go quietly, and 2 weeks into the process, Deanne made a mistake that changed everything. She went to Curtis, Nathan's older brother, and asked him to have a word with Nathan about toning down the aggression in the divorce filing, not realizing that Curtis and Patris had been growing increasingly uneasy about their own situation with Diane for reasons that had nothing to do with me. Patris, it turned out, had overheard Diane on a separate occasion discussing similar plans regarding Curtis and Patris's own finances, specifically Diane's intention to eventually push for control over the trust meant for their son once Diane's health declined. Cutting Curtis out of decision-making entirely in favor of protecting the family name properly. When Patris heard about what Diane had done to me, something in her finally connected the pattern she'd been quietly worried about for years, and she reached out to me directly, an act of quiet courage I will never forget. She called me on a Thursday evening, her voice hesitant in a way I'd never heard from her before, because in the 7 years I'd known Patris, she had always struck me as unshakable, the kind of woman who navigated Diane's favoritism with a practiced, protective calm I'd envied more than once. "I need to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to know I should have said it a long time ago to someone, anyone, and I didn't, because I told myself it wasn't my business, and I think that was a mistake I've been making for years." She told me about a dinner 18 months earlier, before Curtis's son had even been born, where Diane had laid out, almost casually over dessert, a plan to eventually restructure the family trust so that control passed entirely to her rather than being split between her sons as their father's will had originally specified. She said something like, "Curtis is too soft with money, and God knows what kind of woman Nathan will end up with," Patris said, and I could hear the discomfort in her voice even remembering it. At the time I thought she just meant she didn't trust either of you boys' judgment yet. I didn't understand until now that she meant she didn't trust either of you not to actually let your wives have equal say in anything. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked, though some part of me already understood the answer before she said it. "Because Curtis told me what happened to you," Patris said. "The recording, the doctor, all of it, and I realized this isn't just about you and Nathan. This is who she is, this is what she does, and I am done pretending I didn't already know that." Patris's willingness to testify, combined with 2 years of her own quietly documented concerns, text messages to a close friend expressing unease about Diane's comments on finances, a journal entry describing that exact dinner in detail dated the same week it happened, became some of the most powerful corroborating evidence Priya had, because it established a pattern extending well beyond a single aggrieved daughter-in-law with a grudge. "Judges are trained to be skeptical of a single account," Priya told me. "They are far less skeptical when two separate people, with no reason to coordinate a story, describe the same behavior independently years apart. Patris didn't just help your case, she made it very hard for anyone to dismiss." Patris's testimony, corroborated by 2 years of her own documented concerns about Diane's control over family finances, became powerful supporting evidence in both the custody matter and the broader financial fraud complaint Priya had filed on my behalf regarding my father's estate. Curtis, for his part, chose not to defend his mother once he understood the full scope of what she'd done, which Priya told me afterward was rarer than I might think in cases like this, and something I was quietly, deeply grateful for. The mediation hearing took place 7 weeks after the afternoon in the car. Nathan arrived with a new attorney, a tired-looking man who clearly understood by then that the recording, the financial trail, the medical board complaint, and now Patris's corroborating statement had left almost no room to maneuver. Priya played 11 minutes of the recording in that mediation room, the same 11 minutes I had sat frozen through in my car weeks earlier, and I watched Nathan's face as he heard his own voice discussing my instability like a business problem to be managed. Watched something in him finally crack under the weight of hearing it played back in a room full of professionals whose job was to judge exactly that kind of behavior. The mediator, a retired family court judge named Harold Weiss, who Priya had described beforehand as impossible to read but very hard to fool, stopped the recording twice to ask clarifying questions, once when Diane's voice mentioned the psychiatrist by name, and once when Nathan's voice confirmed the timeline for Vanessa moving in once things settled down for Lily's sake. Nathan's attorney requested a short recess after that second pause, and when they returned 20 minutes later, his entire posture had changed, the posture of a man who had just been told by his own counsel exactly how bad his position had become. Diane wasn't in the room for the mediation itself, but her attorney, retained separately once the medical board complaint became public, sat 2 seats down looking increasingly uncomfortable as Robert Alvarez's forensic report was entered as a supporting exhibit. Robert testified for nearly 40 minutes about the transfer patterns, walking through spreadsheets projected onto a screen at the front of the room, and I watched several jurors' worth of attention. Even though this wasn't a jury trial, several sets of professional eyes in that room narrow with the particular focus people get when numbers stop being abstract and start telling a very specific human story. Priya introduced the title company documents next, the certified copies showing my father's estate as the explicit source of the down payment, and Judge Weiss read the relevant paragraph aloud himself, slowly, before setting the page down and looking directly at Nathan's attorney. "I want to be clear about something," he said. "This isn't a case where the source of these funds is ambiguous or in dispute. It's notarized, it's specific, and your client signed acknowledgement of it at closing. I'd encourage a conversation with your client about how much further we actually need to take this today." He didn't fight for full custody after that. His attorney recommended strongly that he not risk it, given what a judge would likely conclude from the totality of the evidence, and Nathan, for possibly the first time in the entire process, listened to good advice. We settled on a custody arrangement that gave me primary residential custody with generous, supervised transition visitation for Nathan, contingent on continued counseling, which the judge in the formal hearing later made a mandatory condition of the arrangement. The house stayed mine outright, awarded in recognition of the documented source of the down payment, with Nathan's name removed from the deed as part of the settlement, a small mercy I hadn't even asked for but that Priya fought for anyway on principle, as she put it. The diverted funds Nathan had hidden were ordered returned in full, with an additional penalty assessed for the deliberate concealment once the forensic report was formally entered into evidence. Dr. Felt's involvement, once reported to the state medical board alongside the recorded conversation describing the arrangement in advance, resulted in a full investigation, and I later learned through Priya that his license was suspended pending the outcome, a small piece of justice that had nothing directly to do with me but felt like it mattered anyway. Vanessa, as it turned out, hadn't known the full scope of what Nathan and Diane were planning, at least not the psychiatric evaluation part, and when the story became impossible to avoid within Nathan's small firm, she ended things with him herself, unwilling. She reportedly told a mutual coworker to be the woman a man used to steal a house from his kid's mother. I take no pleasure in that particular detail, but I won't pretend it didn't feel like something settling into place the way it should have from the start. Diane's relationship with Curtis and Patris never fully recovered, and the trust she'd hoped to eventually control was restructured with an independent trustee once Curtis, quietly and permanently, stopped trusting his mother's judgment regarding money or family loyalty. The last I heard, Diane had moved 2 states away to live near a cousin, and Nathan, based on what little contact remains between us regarding Lily, speaks to his mother only rarely now, something I never expected to feel even a flicker of sympathy toward, but grief has a way of surprising you with which feelings survive and which ones don't. The formal divorce hearing came 4 months after the mediation, delayed partly by the ongoing medical board investigation into Dr. Felt and partly by Nathan's attorney requesting additional time to review the forensic accounting report line by line, hoping, I think, to find some error large enough to reopen the financial settlement. He never found one. Robert Alvarez's work had been too careful, every transfer traced to a specific date, a specific account, a specific pattern that told its own story without needing my testimony to reinforce it. I stood in the courthouse hallway that morning in a navy blue dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion, not out of vanity but because I wanted to remember, years later, that I had chosen exactly what I wore on the day my marriage legally ended, that nothing about that moment had been left to chance or to someone else's convenience. Grace stood beside me the entire time, Marcus a few feet away reviewing paperwork one final time out of habit even though his part in the case had been finished for weeks, and Priya arrived 20 minutes early, the way she had for every single appointment across the whole process, calm and prepared in a way that had become, over 4 months, the steadiest thing in my life. Nathan looked smaller in that courtroom than I remembered him looking at any point during our marriage, not physically, but in some quieter way, the posture of a man who had spent his whole adult life believing he would always land on his feet and was only now confronting the possibility that this time, he might not. The judge read through the settlement terms methodically, the house, the returned funds, the custody arrangement, the counseling requirement, and Nathan answered, "Yes, Your Honor," to each confirmation in a flat, worn-down voice that bore almost no resemblance to the confident tone I'd heard through that hidden camera months earlier, calmly discussing my psychiatric evaluation like a line item on a checklist. When the judge finalized the divorce, there was no dramatic gavel, no movie-style moment of triumph, just a quiet stamp on a page and a clerk sliding paperwork across a desk, and I remember feeling almost disoriented by how anticlimactic it was, how something that had consumed nearly a year of my life ended in less time than it takes to order dinner. Grace hugged me in the hallway afterward, tight enough that I felt it in my ribs, and said, "It's over, Em, you did it. You actually did it," and something in me finally allowed itself to believe that sentence completely, for the first time since that afternoon behind the church. I drove home alone that afternoon, windows down despite the cold, because I wanted the noise of the road instead of silence, wanted something loud enough to fill the space where 9 months of vigilance had lived inside my chest. I picked Lily up from Grace's a little early, and when she ran toward me across the living room, arms out, shrieking my name the way toddlers do when they haven't seen you in several hours and have decided this constitutes a genuine tragedy, I picked her up and held her longer than the moment probably called for, breathing in the specific smell of her hair, sunscreen, and something sweet Grace's kids had clearly been eating. That night after Lily fell asleep, I sat alone at the kitchen table in the house that was now, finally, undeniably only mine, and I allowed myself, for the first time since the afternoon in the car, to simply feel everything at once without immediately managing it, without strategizing around it, without treating my own emotions as evidence to be filed away for later use. I cried for a long time, not the performance of stress Diane had tried to accuse me of at that dinner table months earlier, but something real and overdue, grief for the marriage I'd once believed I had, relief that the fight to protect my daughter was finally, legally, permanently over. In the weeks after the mediation, I learned more about how close I had come to losing everything than I think I could have absorbed in the moment it was actually happening. Priya told me that Dr. Felt's initial evaluation draft, obtained later through discovery, had already been written before he ever met me. A document built entirely from second-hand descriptions Deanne had fed him over 2 dinners, containing clinical language about erratic mood presentation and risk indicators consistent with untreated postpartum psychosis, that bore no resemblance to any actual interaction with a licensed professional and me. Reading that draft was one of the strangest experiences of my life, seeing a stranger's confident, clinical description of a woman who had never existed, a woman built entirely out of my mother-in-law's resentment and my husband's convenience. The state medical board's investigation into Dr. Felt moved faster than Priya had expected, partly, she suspected, because the recording made the misconduct so explicit that there was little room for the usual drawn-out defense. His license was suspended pending a full hearing 8 months later, and though I never learned the final outcome with certainty, Priya mentioned hearing through professional channels that he'd voluntarily surrendered his license rather than continue fighting it, likely to avoid the 2 prior complaints being reopened alongside this one. Vanessa reached out to me once, nearly 3 months after everything became public within Nathan's firm, through a brief, awkward email that Priya advised me not to respond to directly, but that I read more times than I probably should have. She said she hadn't known about the psychiatric evaluation plan, hadn't known about the money, and that finding out changed how she saw the entire relationship in ways she was still working through. I believed her mostly, though belief didn't change how I felt about the 8 months that came before that discovery, and I never wrote back. Curtis and Patris invited Lily and me to their son's 3rd birthday party 6 months after the divorce was finalized, the first time I'd seen either of them since Patris's testimony, and the visit was quiet and a little tentative but genuinely warm, the 2 boys, Lily and their son, chasing each other around the backyard while Patris and I sat on the porch steps not talking about any of it, just watching our kids exist in a world we'd both fought hard to make safer for them. Patris told me once, almost in passing, that cutting ties with Diane's version of family loyalty was the best decision she and Curtis had ever made together, and I understood exactly what she meant because I'd made the same decision myself, just from a very different angle. The counseling requirement built into Nathan's visitation arrangement turned out to matter more than I expected it to. He's a different father now during his time with Lily than the man I watched plan my erasure through a hidden camera, more present, more careful, and though I don't know if that change reflects real growth or simply the fear of losing access to his daughter entirely, I've decided it doesn't matter which one it is, as long as Lily is safe and cared for when she's with him. We don't talk much beyond logistics, drop-off times, school forms, the occasional medical decision that requires both our signatures, and that distance, once painful to imagine, now feels like exactly the right amount of space for both of us. It's been a year since that afternoon behind the church, and Lily just turned 3. She doesn't remember any of it, not really, not the mediation rooms or the recordings or the long months where I sat awake at night wondering if I'd imagined a plot too cruel to be real. She remembers the new swing set in our backyard, the one I bought with the returned funds, and the fact that her mother, as far as she's concerned, has always simply been hers. I still keep the little bird figurine on the bookshelf, the empty one now, camera removed, because sometimes I think about throwing it away and I never quite do. It reminds me that the moment I trusted the sick feeling in my stomach instead of the reassurances everyone else kept offering me was the moment I actually started protecting my daughter, instead of just hoping someone else would do it for me. I went back to work part-time about 8 months ago, the same hospital administration job I'd had before Lily was born, and my coworkers, most of whom knew only fragments of what had happened, treated me with a kind of quiet respect I hadn't expected, the respect people give someone who has clearly survived something without needing to hear the details spelled out. My supervisor, a woman named Ellen who'd gone through her own difficult divorce years earlier, pulled me aside my first week back and said simply, "You look like someone who finally stopped holding her breath," and I laughed because it was true, and because I hadn't realized until she said it out loud just how long I'd been holding it. Grace still calls me most evenings, usually right around Lily's bedtime, and most nights we don't even talk about anything related to the divorce anymore, just ordinary sister things, recipes and work gossip, and whatever show she's currently annoyed her husband for not watching with her. And there is something enormously healing about a friendship that no longer has to orbit entirely around your worst year. Marcus still checks in on the paperwork side of things occasionally, out of habit more than necessity now, and Priya sent a card on Lily's third birthday that simply read, "Watching you build this life has been one of the privileges of my career, which I have kept in the drawer of my nightstand ever since." I think often about the version of myself sitting frozen in that car behind the church, 11 minutes of silence while the ground fell away beneath her, and I wish I could reach back through time and tell her what I know now, that the worst moment of her life was also, without her realizing it yet, the beginning of the only life that was ever actually hers to build. She didn't know yet that the fear in her chest would turn into fuel, that the 11 minutes of frozen silence would become 11 minutes of the clearest thinking she'd ever done, methodical and exact, the exact opposite of the unstable woman they'd been building a case to invent. If you're sitting somewhere right now with that same low hum of wrongness in your chest, the one everyone around you insists is nothing, I want you to hear this clearly. You don't need anyone's permission to trust yourself, get the proof, build the case. Protect what's yours, quietly, patiently, and completely, because the people who count on you underestimating yourself are usually the same people who most need you not to. There is a particular kind of strength that only shows up after everything else has been stripped away, the kind you don't know you have until the exact moment you need it, and I hope, whatever you're facing, you never have to find yours the way I found mine. But if you do, I promise you this, it will be there, waiting, exactly when you need it most. If this story meant something to you, you already know what to do. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.